My name is Dr. Rebecca Walsh, and I have 3 PhDs in mechanical engineering, materials science, and industrial design. My patents are used in manufacturing processes across 17 industries. I'm the CEO of a venture capital firm that specializes in acquiring and restructuring failing manufacturing companies. Forbes called me one of the most innovative minds in American industry. But 14 years ago, I was standing on a factory floor at 5 a.m., operating the same metal press I'd been assigned to since I was 18, while my stepfather walked past me without acknowledging my existence, and my stepbrothers slept off hangovers in their luxury apartments paid for with trust funds that should have included me. 14 years ago, I was told I was too stupid for college, that I didn't have what it took to succeed in higher education, that the best thing I could do with my life was honest manual labor that would teach me the value of hard work. Those were lies, all of it, every single word. And the man who told me those lies, the man who stole my future and my education and 14 years of my life, is about to learn what happens when you underestimate someone just because you can exploit them. This is the story of how I went from a factory floor to the boardroom. This is the story of how the stupid stepdaughter became the genius her stepfather never saw coming. And this is the story of how I bought his entire company for $1 and made him watch as I dismantled everything he built. I need to start at the beginning because the cruelty of what happened to me only makes sense with context. My mother married Richard Brennan when I was 16 years old. She had been a widow for 3 years. My biological father died of cancer when I was 13, and Richard presented himself as the answer to all our problems. He was successful, wealthy, stable. He owned Brennan Industrial Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that produced precision metal components for various industries. He also had 2 sons from his first marriage, Chad, who was 18 when our parents married, and Derek, who was 20. Both were preparing for college, both were arrogant in the way that rich boys often are, and both made it clear from day one that they viewed my mother and me as interlopers in their family legacy. My mother was so desperate for security after years of struggling as a widow that she ignored every warning sign: Richard's controlling behavior, his son's hostility, the way he spoke about women as decoration rather than people. She convinced herself that love would conquer all, that time would smooth over the rough edges, that we would become a real family. I knew better, but I was 16, and my opinion didn't matter. The first year was tolerable. I was still in high school, still had my own life separate from the Brennan family drama. I excelled academically, particularly in math and science, and I was planning to apply to top engineering programs. MIT was my dream school. I had the grades, the test scores, the extracurricular activities. My guidance counselor said I had an excellent chance of acceptance. I worked part-time at a local hardware store to save money for application fees and eventually for college expenses. I knew Richard wasn't going to pay for my education. He had made that clear, but I was fine with that. I would get scholarships, take out loans, work my way through if I had to. I was going to college, and I was going to study engineering, and I was going to build a career that would ensure I never had to depend on anyone the way my mother depended on Richard. I got my MIT acceptance letter in March of my senior year. I was ecstatic I had done it. I had gotten into one of the best engineering schools in the world. The financial aid package wasn't as generous as I'd hoped, but it was workable. With loans and a part-time job, I could make it happen. I showed my mother the letter that evening, expecting her to be proud, to be excited, to see this as validation that her daughter was going to be okay. Instead, she looked worried. "Rebecca, this is wonderful, but we need to talk to Richard about this." "Why? It's my decision. I'm 18. I have financial aid. I don't need his permission." "He's your stepfather. He's the head of this household. We should at least discuss it with him." I didn't want to discuss it with Richard, but my mother insisted, and I foolishly agreed. That conversation changed the entire trajectory of my life. Richard sat in his home office, the one we weren't allowed to enter without permission, and listened as I explained about MIT, about my plans, about the financial aid package, and how I would make it work. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "No," he said finally. I blinked. "No. You're not going to MIT. You're not going to any college. It's a waste of time and money for someone like you." "Someone like me, I got into MIT. That proves I'm capable." "It proves that you're good at taking tests. That's not the same as being intelligent or having practical skills. College, especially an expensive school like MIT, is for people who can actually make use of that education. You're not one of those people." I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I'm capable of. I know that you're an average girl with delusions of grandeur. I know that spending 4 years and tens of thousands of dollars on an engineering degree for someone without the intellectual capacity to use it is foolish. And I know that I'm not going to enable this fantasy. I'm not asking you to enable anything. I have financial aid. I'll take out loans. You're 18 years old. You can't take out private student loans without a cosigner. And I'm not going to cosign for a loan that you'll never be able to pay back because you'll never get the kind of job that requires an MIT degree. My mother, who had been sitting silently beside me, finally spoke up. Richard, maybe we should. Jennifer, this discussion is over. Rebecca is not going to MIT. He turned to me, his expression cold. However, I'm not completely unreasonable. I'm offering you an opportunity. Come work at Brennan Industrial. Start on the factory floor, learn real skills, earn a real paycheck. If you work hard and prove yourself, there's potential for advancement. You could have a career, a steady income, stability. That's better than drowning in student debt for a degree you'll never use. I couldn't speak. The shock of having my entire future dismantled in a 5-minute conversation had left me speechless. You have until the end of the week to decide, Richard said. Accept my offer or figure out how you're going to support yourself without my help or your mother's. Those are your options. I looked at my mother, silently begging her to intervene, to stand up for me, to choose her daughter over her husband. She looked down at her hands. That's when I knew I had lost. I tried everything I could think of over the following days. I called the financial aid office at MIT, explaining my situation, asking if there were any options for students whose families refused to support them. They were sympathetic but ultimately couldn't help. The aid package was already calculated, and there weren't additional resources available. I looked into emancipation, thinking that if I were legally independent, I might qualify for different aid. But I was already 18. Emancipation wasn't relevant anymore. And the process of establishing financial independence for aid purposes required documentation that I didn't have and couldn't get without time I didn't have. I researched scholarships, grants, any possible source of funding. But with only a few months until school started, there wasn't enough time to apply and receive enough money to make up the gap. I was trapped. Richard had designed it perfectly. He was wealthy enough that my financial aid package was limited, but he refused to contribute anything. And without his co-signature, I couldn't borrow enough to make up the difference. He had created a situation where my only realistic options were accepting his offer or, I didn't even know what the alternative was, living on the street, working minimum wage jobs, and hoping to save enough to eventually afford community college. My mother, meanwhile, actively encouraged me to take Richard's offer. It's not what you planned, I know, but it's a good opportunity, steady work, good pay, and Richard says if you prove yourself, there's room for advancement. Maybe this is better than college anyway. You'll have work experience while your peers are accumulating debt. She had convinced herself that Richard was being generous rather than manipulative, or maybe she knew the truth and chose to believe the lie because it was easier. Either way, she wasn't going to help me. 1 week after that conversation in Richard's office, I deferred my MIT acceptance and started working at Brennan Industrial Manufacturing. I told myself it would be temporary. I would work for a year, save money, figure out a path to college. This was just a detour, not a destination. I had no idea that Richard had no intention of ever letting me leave. The factory floor was brutal. I was assigned to the metal pressing station, operating a machine that stamped precision parts from sheet metal. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and mind-numbing. The same motion, thousands of times a day, standing on concrete floors for 10-hour shifts. The other factory workers were kind enough, but there was a clear division. I was the boss's stepdaughter, which meant I was viewed with suspicion. Was I a spy for management? Was I being groomed for a supervisory position? Why was I working on the floor at all when I should have been in college like Richard's biological sons? I tried to explain that I wasn't there by choice, that Richard had forced this situation, but it sounded like excuses, like a privileged kid complaining about having to do real work. So eventually I stopped explaining and just did my job. The pay was decent, better than minimum wage at least, but not as good as Richard had implied, and living at home meant that Richard controlled most aspects of my life. He instituted a rent that took a significant portion of my paycheck. He required me to contribute to household expenses. He imposed fines for minor infractions of house rules. By the end of each month, I had saved almost nothing. When I confronted him about this, he was dismissive. "You're learning financial responsibility. This is what adult life costs. If you can't manage your money on a factory salary, how would you have handled college expenses?" It was a trap. Every part of the situation was designed to keep me stuck, dependent, unable to accumulate the resources I would need to escape. After 6 months, I tried to leave anyway. I had saved a little money, not much, but enough to rent a room somewhere. I could work at the factory and live independently, and maybe without Richard's rent and fines, I could actually start saving for school. Richard called me into his office the day I gave notice at the house. "If you move out, you're fired," he said simply. "You can't fire me for where I live. I can fire you for any reason I want, and if you're not living under my roof, following my rules, you're not working in my factory. Your choice." I couldn't afford to lose the job. Without it, I had no income at all. I would burn through my tiny savings in weeks and end up worse off than before. I stayed. And that pattern repeated over and over for years. Every time I tried to leave, Richard created a new obstacle. Every time I saved a little money, a new expense appeared. Every time I looked for other work, Richard would somehow sabotage it. A bad reference, a phone call to the potential employer, something that ensured the opportunity disappeared. Meanwhile, Chad and Derek were thriving. Chad graduated from Princeton and went to Harvard Business School. Derek graduated from Yale and got a job at a prestigious consulting firm. Both were being groomed to eventually take over Brennan Industrial. Both had trust funds that provided comfortable incomes even before they worked a day in their lives. And I was still on the factory floor, operating the same metal press, wearing the same uniform, trapped in the same nightmare that I couldn't escape. Years passed, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. I watched opportunities slip away. I watched my former classmates graduate from college, start careers, build lives. I watched myself become exactly what Richard had predicted, a factory worker with no prospects, no future, no way out. The thing that kept me sane during those years was learning. I couldn't afford college, but I could educate myself. I spent my lunch breaks in the factory reading technical manuals, engineering textbooks, industry publications. I taught myself CAD software on an old computer I bought at a thrift store. I studied metallurgy, manufacturing processes, industrial design, all the things I would have learned at MIT, except I was learning them alone, in the few hours between work and sleep. The other thing that kept me sane was observing. Brennan Industrial was successful, but it wasn't well run. I could see inefficiencies everywhere. Outdated processes that wasted time and materials, equipment that broke down constantly because maintenance was deferred, supply chain problems that created bottlenecks and delays. I started documenting these problems, not because I thought anyone would listen to me. I was just a factory worker, and my suggestions had been dismissed the few times I'd tried to offer them, but because it gave me something to think about besides how trapped I was. I filled notebooks with observations, calculations, proposed solutions. I redesigned processes in my head, figured out how workflow could be improved, identified suppliers who could provide better materials at lower costs. It was a fantasy, mostly, a way to pretend that my brain hadn't atrophied from years of repetitive manual labor, that I was still the girl who had gotten into MIT. But those notebooks would eventually become the blueprint for something much bigger than I imagined. The turning point came during my 9th year at Brennan Industrial. I was 27 years old. I had been working at the factory for nearly a decade, and the hope that had sustained me early on had long since faded. I had accepted that this was my life. This was all I was ever going to be. And then I met Dr. Sarah Chen. Dr. Chen was a consultant that Richard had hired to evaluate the factory's operations and recommend efficiency improvements. She had a PhD in industrial engineering from Stanford and ran a consulting firm that specialized in manufacturing optimization. She spent 3 weeks observing the factory floor, and during that time, she noticed something that no one else had. I was doing things differently than my coworkers. Small things, adjusting the metal press angle to reduce waste, reorganizing my workspace to minimize unnecessary movements, batch processing certain tasks to improve speed without sacrificing quality. On her last day, she approached me during lunch break. "You're Rebecca, right?" "Yes." "I've been watching you work. You're much more efficient than the others on your line. Have you had formal training in industrial processes?" I almost laughed. No, I pay attention. I try to find better ways to do things. Do you mind if I ask why you're working here? You clearly have aptitude for this kind of analysis. Have you considered going to school for engineering? The question hurt more than she could have known. I got into MIT, I said quietly, almost 10 years ago, couldn't afford it. Dr. Chen looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. MIT, for engineering. Mechanical engineering. And now you're operating a metal press. Now I'm operating a metal press. She was silent for a moment. Then, can I see your workspace? I took her to my station, expecting her to look at the press itself. Instead, she noticed the notebook I kept tucked under the equipment, one of many where I documented my observations. May I? She asked, gesturing to the notebook. I hesitated, then nodded. She flipped through pages of diagrams, calculations, process improvements, efficiency analyses. Her expression changed as she read, becoming more focused, more intense. You did all of this. Yes, it's just, I don't know, thinking it's not. This is graduate-level process analysis. Some of these solutions are better than what my firm would have proposed. This, she tapped a page showing a workflow redesign. This would save the company approximately $40,000 per year in this department alone. I stared at her, really. Really, Rebecca, have you shown these to anyone, to management? I suggested a few things early on. They weren't interested in hearing from a factory worker. Dr. Chen closed the notebook and handed it back to me. Then she pulled out a business card. I want you to call me, not now. I understand there are complications with you working here, but when you're ready to leave this place, call me. I think you have extraordinary potential, and I'd like to help you develop it. I took the card, not quite believing what I was hearing. I can't just leave, it's complicated. I know it's complicated, but you're 27 years old, Rebecca. If you stay here for another decade, you'll be 37 with nothing but regrets. At some point, you have to choose your own future over whatever's keeping you trapped. She left that afternoon, and I stood on the factory floor holding her business card, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: hope. It took me 3 more years to finally make the call. I know that sounds insane. 3 more years wasted, 3 more years trapped when I had been handed a potential escape route. But Richard's control was more psychological than physical. He had spent years convincing me that I couldn't survive without him, that I had no skills, that the outside world would chew me up and spit me out. Breaking free of that programming took time. But I did break free eventually, and when I did, everything changed. If you're still watching, if Rebecca's story is resonating with you, if you're feeling the weight of those lost years and the hope of what might come next, I need to know where you're watching from right now. Drop your location in the comments, globe showing Americas. Are you watching from New York or California, Texas or Florida? Maybe you're in the UK, Canada, Australia, India, the Philippines, Nigeria, Brazil, Germany, France, Mexico, South Africa, Japan. And while you're down there in the comments, subscribe to this channel, bell. I called Dr. Chen on a Tuesday evening in September, 3 years after we first met. I was 30 years old, and I had finally accepted that if I didn't make a change, I would die in that factory without ever knowing what I could have become. Dr. Chen, this is Rebecca Walsh. We met at Brennan Industrial about 3 years ago. You told me to call when I was ready to leave. There was a pause then. Rebecca, I remember. Are you ready? Yes. Good. When can you meet? We met 2 days later at a coffee shop far enough from the factory that no one from Brennan would see us. I brought all my notebooks, years of observations, analyses, proposed solutions to problems that management had never let me solve. Dr. Chen spent 2 hours reviewing my work, asking questions, testing my understanding of the concepts I'd self-taught. At the end, she sat back and shook her head. This is PhD level work, you know that, right? I don't have a degree at all. I don't even have college credits. Formal credentials and actual knowledge aren't always the same thing. You have the knowledge, we just need to get you the credentials. She explained her proposal. She had connections at several universities with programs designed for non-traditional students. She believed she could help me get accepted into a program, possibly even with scholarship funding, based on the portfolio of work I had compiled. It won't be easy, she warned. You'll be older than most of your classmates. You'll have to work incredibly hard to prove yourself, but I think you can do it. More importantly, I think you deserve the chance." I wanted to cry. After a decade of being told I was too stupid for college, someone was telling me I could do PhD-level work. "What about money? I have some savings, but not much, and if I quit Brennan, I'll have no income." "I have a research grant. I can hire you as a research assistant. It won't be a lot of money, but it'll be enough to live on while you go to school. You'll help with my consulting projects, and in exchange, you'll get practical experience and a paycheck." It was everything I needed, everything I had been waiting for. But there was still one obstacle: Richard. "I need to tell my stepfather I'm leaving. He's going to try to stop me." Dr. Chen's expression hardened. "Based on what you've told me about him, he's going to do more than try. He's going to threaten you, manipulate you, possibly even try to sabotage this opportunity. You need to be prepared for that." "How do I prepare?" "You leave without telling him until it's already done. You move your belongings out while he's not home. You quit the factory with a formal letter, not a conversation. You cut off contact until you're established enough that he can't threaten you back into compliance." It sounded drastic. It sounded like the kind of dramatic break that would permanently end my relationship with my family. But what relationship? Richard had been exploiting me for a decade. My mother had stood by and let it happen. Chad and Derek had benefited from my exclusion and never questioned it. I didn't have a family. I had people who shared a house with me and used me for their convenience. "Okay," I said, "tell me exactly what I need to do." Over the next month, I executed the plan with precision. I was accepted into a special master's program at a state university, a program designed for students with substantial practical experience but no formal credentials. Dr. Chen's recommendation letter and my portfolio of work were enough to overcome the lack of a bachelor's degree. I secured a graduate research assistant position with Dr. Chen's firm, providing enough income to rent a small apartment near campus. I packed my essential belongings in boxes and stored them at a friend's house. And then, on a Wednesday morning, when Richard was at his office and my mother was at her book club, I moved out. I left a note. "I'm leaving to pursue my education. I've accepted a position as a research assistant and enrolled in a graduate program. I won't be returning to Brennan Industrial or to this house. Please don't try to contact me. Rebecca." I also submitted my formal resignation to the factory's HR department, effective immediately. And then I drove to my new apartment, unpacked my boxes, and waited for the explosion. It came that evening in the form of 17 phone calls and a dozen text messages, all from Richard. The messages followed a predictable pattern. Concern: "Is everything okay? Where are you?" Then manipulation: "Your mother is devastated. How could you do this to her?" Then threats: "You'll never make it on your own. You'll come crawling back within a month." Then anger: "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me." I didn't respond to any of them. My mother called too, crying, begging me to come home, telling me that Richard was just worried about me and wanted what was best for me. I didn't respond to her either. After 3 days, the messages stopped. I had called their bluff. They couldn't force me to return, and without leverage over me, they had no power. For the first time in 10 years, I was free. The next 4 years were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. I completed the master's program in 2 years, working 70-hour weeks between classes and research assistants. My thesis focused on manufacturing process optimization, essentially a formalized version of the work I had been doing in my notebooks for years. It was published in a top-tier journal and attracted attention from both industry and academia. I was accepted into a PhD program at the same university. For the next 3 years, I lived on a graduate stipend and research grants, surviving on ramen and coffee while I pursued my doctorate. My dissertation examined next-generation manufacturing techniques using advanced materials and machine learning algorithms. It was groundbreaking enough to attract interest from venture capital firms looking to commercialize the research. At 34 years old, I had 3 advanced degrees and a reputation as one of the brightest minds in industrial engineering. I had also been tracking Brennan Industrial from a distance. The company was struggling. Richard's refusal to modernize, his resistance to efficiency improvements, his reliance on outdated processes, all the problems I had identified years ago had compounded. Market share was declining, profits were shrinking, Key clients were defecting to competitors who could deliver better quality at lower prices. Chad had taken over as CEO when Richard semi-retired, but he was incompetent. He had an MBA from Harvard, but no practical understanding of manufacturing. The strategies he implemented, cost-cutting without addressing underlying inefficiencies, only accelerated the decline. Derek, who handled the business development side, was equally useless. He could schmooze clients, but couldn't retain them once they realized the product quality was declining. The company was dying, and everyone in the industry knew it. I watched this collapse with a mixture of satisfaction and strategic interest, because I was starting to formulate a plan. After completing my PhD, I had been recruited by several companies offering high-paying positions. Instead, I did something unexpected. I used my research as the basis for a startup. The company was called Apex Manufacturing Solutions. We specialized in acquiring struggling manufacturing companies, implementing radical process improvements using my proprietary techniques, and turning them into profitable enterprises. I started with one small acquisition, a factory that was weeks from bankruptcy. I bought it for almost nothing, spent 6 months rebuilding it from the ground up, and sold it 18 months later for a 400% profit. That success attracted investors. I raised a significant fund and began acquiring more companies. Each acquisition followed the same pattern. Identify a fundamentally sound business being run incompetently, buy it cheap, fix it fast, either operate it profitably or sell it for substantial returns. Within 3 years, Apex Manufacturing Solutions had acquired and restructured 9 companies. Our portfolio was worth over $200 million, and I had a personal net worth that exceeded $40 million. I was wealthy, I was successful, I was respected. And I was ready to go after Brennan Industrial. By the time I set my sights on Brennan, the company was in desperate straits. Richard had come out of retirement to try to save the family business, but his outdated approaches only made things worse. Chad and Derek were fighting over who was to blame for the decline. Employees were jumping ship. Suppliers were demanding payment up front. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable. The family was facing financial ruin. The trust funds that had sustained Chad and Derek were tied up in company stock that was rapidly becoming worthless. Richard had mortgaged his personal assets to keep the company afloat. My mother's comfortable lifestyle was about to evaporate. They needed a buyer, someone willing to acquire a failing company and assume its debts. Several firms had looked at Brennan and walked away. The problems were too deep, the necessary restructuring too expensive. Saving the company would require not just capital, but expertise that was rare in the industry. That's when I made my move. Apex Manufacturing Solutions submitted a letter of interest. We proposed to acquire Brennan Industrial for a nominal sum, $1 for the company, plus the assumption of all debts and liabilities. In exchange, we would provide the capital and expertise necessary to restructure the operations and attempt to return the company to profitability. It was their only offer. They had no choice but to accept. The acquisition process took 4 months. During that time, my team conducted extensive due diligence, documenting every problem, every inefficiency, every mistake that had led to this point. We also identified which employees were assets worth keeping and which were part of the problem. Chad, Derek, and Richard all fell into the latter category. The acquisition closed on a Friday in November. The official transfer of ownership would be finalized at a meeting in the Brennan Industrial offices, attended by both families' lawyers, the key stakeholders, and the leadership of both companies. Richard had never asked who owned Apex Manufacturing Solutions. He assumed it was some faceless corporation, some group of investors he would never meet. The actual operations would be handled by professional managers, and he had negotiated a consulting contract for himself and executive positions for his sons. He thought he was engineering a soft landing, a way to save face while extracting himself from the disaster he had created. He had no idea what was about to hit him. The meeting was held in the Brennan Industrial Boardroom, the same boardroom where Richard had made countless decisions about my life without consulting me, where he had planned my future without considering what I wanted. I arrived exactly on time, dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than a month of my old factory wages. My legal team flanked me, 3 attorneys from a prestigious firm, all carrying boxes of documentation. Richard was already seated at the head of the table, with Chad and Derek on either side of him. My mother sat in the corner, looking diminished and anxious. Their attorney sat across from them, reviewing paperwork. When I walked in, there was a moment of confused silence. Richard's face cycled through confusion, then recognition, then shock. Rebecca. Hello, Richard. I took the seat at the opposite end of the table, the power position, directly across from him. What are you doing here? He looked at his attorney, as if expecting an explanation for why an unexpected person was attending a confidential business meeting. I'm here to finalize the acquisition, I said calmly. As the CEO and majority owner of Apex Manufacturing Solutions, I'm the one purchasing Brennan Industrial. The silence was absolute. Chad found his voice first. That's not possible. You're a factory worker. You don't even have a college degree. I have a master's degree in industrial engineering and a PhD in manufacturing systems, both from accredited universities. I also have 17 patents in advanced manufacturing processes, a portfolio of 9 successfully restructured companies, and approximately $43 million in personal assets. I opened my briefcase and pulled out copies of my degrees, my patents, my company's financial statements, all the evidence that I was exactly who I claimed to be. Richard was shaking his head. This is some kind of trick. You couldn't possibly. I not only could, I did. While you were telling everyone I was too stupid for college, I was teaching myself engineering. While you were working me 70 hours a week for minimal pay, I was documenting every inefficiency in your operations. While you were convinced you had successfully trapped me in a life of manual labor, I was building the expertise that would eventually allow me to buy your company for $1. I slid the acquisition contract across the table. This is the agreement your attorney negotiated on your behalf. Apex Manufacturing Solutions acquires all assets and liabilities of Brennan Industrial for the sum of $1. In exchange, we assume all debts, take over all operations, and make all decisions regarding the future of the company. Richard grabbed the contract, scanning it frantically. This says the current management will be terminated immediately upon acquisition. That's correct, Chad. Derek and you are fired, effective as of this meeting. Your consulting contracts are void. Those were negotiated in bad faith, since you weren't dealing with arm's-length buyers, but with someone who has intimate knowledge of your incompetence. You can't do this, Derek slammed his hand on the table. This company is our legacy, our inheritance. Your inheritance is debt and a dying business that you ran into the ground through incompetence and arrogance, and now it's mine. I turned to my attorneys, who began distributing documents. These are the termination agreements. You'll receive the minimum severance required by law, 2 weeks' wages. Your stock in the company is now worthless, since Apex owns 100%. Your personal guarantees on company loans remain in effect, so you'll still be liable for those debts unless the company becomes profitable enough to pay them off. I paused, letting that sink in. Whether the company survives depends entirely on how well I run it, and unlike you, I actually know what I'm doing. Richard was standing now, his face purple with rage. After everything I did for you, I gave you a home, I gave you a job. You exploited me, I said, my voice cold. You stole 10 years of my life because it was profitable for you. You kept me uneducated and dependent because that gave you power over me. You told everyone I was too stupid for college while I was teaching myself the skills that would eventually destroy you. I stood up, meeting his eyes across the table. You were wrong about me, Richard, and that mistake is going to cost you everything. Your mother, he started, gesturing to where my mother sat, tears streaming down her face. My mother chose you over me 10 years ago. She watched you exploit me and did nothing. Whatever consequences she faces now are the result of choices she made. I looked at my mother for the first time since entering the room. She looked old, broken, nothing like the woman who had married Richard and convinced herself it would all work out. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know it would turn out like this. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. I turned back to Richard. One more thing, the factory floor where I worked for 10 years, I'm converting it into an advanced manufacturing research center. It's going to be staffed by graduate students and researchers working on next-generation industrial processes. The metal press I operated for a decade will be donated to a museum as an artifact of outdated manufacturing techniques. I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. I'm transforming the place where you tried to break me into the place where the future of this industry will be built, and every person who works there will know the story, how a factory worker who was told she was too stupid for college became the PhD who saved the company. Richard looked like he was about to have a stroke. Chad and Derek were both pale, clearly doing the math on how much money they had just lost. My mother was sobbing quietly. I gathered my materials and prepared to leave. The paperwork will be finalized by your attorney. You have 48 hours to vacate any company property and remove your personal belongings. After that, anything left behind will be disposed of. Security will escort you from the building. I walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Richard, thank you. Thank you for underestimating me. Thank you for exploiting me. Thank you for giving me the motivation to become someone who could do this to you. I couldn't have gotten here without you. I left the boardroom and walked out of the building, into the parking lot where my car was waiting. As I drove away from Brennan Industrial, the place where I had spent 10 years being told I was worthless, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, not revenge, though there was an element of that. What I felt was closure, the final severing of a chain that had bound me to people who had never valued me. I was free, completely, finally free. And I was just getting started. The restructuring of Brennan Industrial took 18 months. I brought in my team from Apex, experts who had helped me turn around 9 other companies. We implemented every improvement I had documented in my notebooks years ago. We upgraded equipment, streamlined processes, renegotiated supplier contracts, and retrained workers. We also retained most of the factory floor employees, the people who had worked beside me for 10 years. They were good workers. They had just been trapped in a system designed by incompetent management. I offered tuition assistance for anyone who wanted to pursue further education. I implemented profit sharing so that employees would benefit from the company's success. I created pathways for advancement based on merit rather than nepotism. The research center I had promised became a reality. We partnered with 3 universities, bringing in graduate students to work on cutting-edge manufacturing techniques. The old metal press I had operated was indeed donated to the Smithsonian's Industrial History Collection, with a placard explaining its significance. 18 months after the acquisition, Brennan Industrial was profitable again, not just surviving but thriving. We had won back old clients and attracted new ones. Our reputation for quality and innovation was growing. The company that Richard had nearly destroyed was now a model for the industry. As for the Brennan family, they faded into obscurity. Richard tried to start a consulting business, positioning himself as an industry expert. It failed within a year. No one wanted advice from the man who had almost bankrupted Brennan Industrial. Chad and Derek both struggled to find employment. The story of the acquisition had spread through business circles, and everyone knew they had been fired from their own family company for incompetence. They eventually found positions at mid-level firms, far from the executive roles they had expected to occupy. My mother divorced Richard 2 years after the acquisition. She reached out to me once, asking if we could talk, if there was any chance of rebuilding our relationship. I agreed to meet her for coffee. She looked older, worn down by years of stress and regret. She apologized for not standing up for me, for choosing her marriage over her daughter, for all the years she had stood by while Richard exploited me. I was scared, she admitted, scared of being alone again, of not having financial security. I convinced myself that you would be fine, that Richard's way was just different, not wrong. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I listened to her apology, to her explanations, to her regrets. And when she finished, I said, I appreciate you saying this, but an apology doesn't undo 10 years of my life. It doesn't give me back the education I should have had, the opportunities I lost, the potential that was wasted while I operated a metal press. I know it's not enough, but is there any chance we could start over, try to rebuild something? I thought about it carefully before answering. I don't think so, not because I hate you, but because I don't trust you. When things got hard, when you had to choose between my well-being and your comfort, you chose your comfort. I can't build a relationship with someone knowing they'll make that choice again. She cried. I didn't. We finished our coffee in silence, and then we went our separate ways. I haven't spoken to her since. Some people might judge me for that, for not forgiving, for not giving her another chance, for not choosing family over grudges. But I learned a long time ago that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up for you, who fights for you, who believes in you when everyone else says you're worthless. By that definition, Dr. Sarah Chen was more family to me than my mother ever was. The years continued to pass. Apex Manufacturing Solutions continued to grow, acquiring and restructuring companies across the country. I became a recognized expert in the field, invited to speak at conferences, consulted by Fortune 500 companies, featured in business publications. I also became an advocate for education access. I established a scholarship fund for non-traditional students, people who had been denied conventional educational pathways, but who had the intelligence and drive to succeed if given a chance. The fund covered tuition, living expenses, and provided mentorship from industry professionals. Every year, I personally reviewed applications and selected recipients. I looked for people like me, people who had been told they weren't smart enough, who had been trapped by circumstances, who just needed someone to believe in them. I wanted to be for others what Dr. Chen had been for me. At 38, I sold Apex Manufacturing Solutions to a larger private equity firm for $380 million. My share of that sale was approximately $160 million. I used part of that money to establish a foundation dedicated to manufacturing education and workforce development. I used another part to fund research into sustainable manufacturing techniques, and I kept enough to ensure I would never again be dependent on anyone for my survival. I also bought a house, a beautiful modern home with large windows and an open floor plan, no storage rooms, no places where people could be hidden away and forgotten. And in one room of that house, I built a memorial. On the wall, I hung my MIT acceptance letter, the one from 20 years ago that I had never been able to act on. Beside it, I hung my master's degree and my PhD diploma. Below those, I placed a photograph of the metal press I had operated for 10 years, the one now sitting in the Smithsonian. And underneath the photograph, I placed a placard with a quote I had written myself. They told me I was too stupid for college. I became Dr. Rebecca Walsh. They told me I would never amount to anything. I bought their company for $1. They told me to know my place. I built a new place where people like me could thrive. Never let anyone else define your potential. I look at that memorial sometimes, when I need to remember how far I've come, when I need to remind myself that the person who was trapped on that factory floor became the person who now controls her own destiny. The journey from there to here was brutal. It cost me 10 years, countless opportunities, and relationships that could never be repaired. But I made it, despite everything they did to stop me, despite every obstacle they placed in my path, despite their absolute certainty that I would never be anything more than a factory worker. I made it. And that is the victory that no one can ever take away. Last week, I visited Brennan Industrial for the first time in years. The facility had been completely transformed. The old factory floor was now a state-of-the-art research center, filled with advanced equipment and brilliant young minds working on projects that would shape the future of manufacturing. I walked through the space where I had once stood for 10-hour shifts, operating the same machine, believing I would never be anything more. Now that space was filled with possibility, with innovation, with people who were being given the chances I had been denied. One of the graduate students approached me, a young woman who was working on her dissertation. Dr. Walsh, I just wanted to say thank you. The scholarship you provided made it possible for me to be here. I was working 2 jobs and thought I'd never be able to afford graduate school, and then your foundation gave me a chance. I looked at her and saw myself at that age, full of potential that the world was trying to suppress, deserving of opportunities that seemed impossibly out of reach. You earned it, I told her. The scholarship just removed the barriers. What you do with the opportunity is all you. She smiled, thanked me again, and went back to her work. I stayed for another hour, watching researchers collaborate, watching ideas take shape, watching the future being built in the space where I had almost lost mine. And I thought about Richard, wherever he was, diminished, irrelevant, remembered only as a cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate people. I thought about Chad and Derek, struggling through careers that never lived up to the potential they thought they were entitled to. I thought about my mother, living with the consequences of choices she made 20 years ago. And I thought about myself, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, CEO, philanthropist, advocate, success story. I had won completely, undeniably. But more importantly, I had survived. I had taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and transformed it into fuel for becoming someone extraordinary. The factory floor had tried to break me. Instead, it forged me into someone who could buy the factory and turn it into something beautiful. And that, more than any amount of money or any professional achievement, is the real story. The story of how the girl they said was too stupid for college became the doctor who changed an industry. The story of how the factory worker became the owner. The story of how powerlessness became power. That's my story, that's my victory. And I'm still writing new chapters. Clapper board if you made it to the end, clapper board. Thank you, seriously. Thank you for witnessing Rebecca's journey from that factory floor to the boardroom. Thank you for caring about what happened to her. Thank you for being part of this community that believes people can overcome impossible odds. Now I need you to do 2 things for me. First, like this video. If Rebecca's story moved you, if it made you angry at the injustice, if it made you cheer when she walked into that boardroom and took everything, hit that like button right now. Let me know this story resonated with you. Second, subscribe to this channel, bell, because we have so many more stories coming, stories about the dropout who bought his father's company, the failure daughter who became her sibling's boss, the forgotten child who owned the bank that foreclosed on the family home, the worthless son who controlled every asset his family depended on. Every single story is about proving the doubters wrong. Every story is about justice. Every story is for you. So subscribe right now, hit that notification bell, be here for the next one. And I want you to do one more thing. Leave a comment telling me what moment in Rebecca's story hit you the hardest. Was it when Richard forced her to work in the factory instead of going to MIT? Was it when Dr. Chen recognized her genius? Was it when she walked into that boardroom and revealed she was buying the company? Was it when she built the research center where the factory floor used to be? Tell me in the comments. Let's build this community together. Let's support each other in the belief that no one has the right to define our potential except us. Like, subscribe, comment, share. This channel exists because of you. These stories reach people because you help spread them. This community grows because you're part of it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that stories like Rebecca's matter. See you in the next one, Black Heart. Remember, they can underestimate you, they can exploit you, they can try to break you. But if you refuse to stay broken, if you document everything, if you wait for your moment and then strike with precision, you can take it all back. Stay powerful, stay strategic, stay unstoppable. We'll see you soon.